July 12, 1943, Kursk salient, Soviet Union. Captain Alexander Pokryshkin pulls back on the stick of his Bell P-39 Airacobra, climbing away from the inferno below. Black smoke rises from 6 burning Soviet tanks. German Stukas have just completed another textbook dive-bombing run, their sirens still echoing across the steppe. His fighter squadron arrived too late. Again. The statistics are catastrophic. In the first week of Operation Citadel, German dive bombers destroy over 400 Soviet armored vehicles. Soviet fighters intercept fewer than 20% of Stuka formations before they release their bombs. The Luftwaffe's Ju-87 pilots operate with near impunity, turning the greatest tank battle in history into a shooting gallery. Pokryshkin's Airacobra is fast at low altitude. Its 37mm nose cannon can shred a bomber, but by the time Soviet fighters climb to intercept altitude, the Stukas have already dropped their payloads and scattered. The mathematics are simple and brutal. Climb rate determines survival rate, and Soviet tanks are dying because fighters arrive minutes too late. What Pokryshkin doesn't know as he watches another column of armor burn is that within 72 hours, he will discover a technique so dangerous that Soviet Aviation Command will threaten him with court-martial, a maneuver that violates every principle in the fighter pilot's manual, a dive attack profile that transforms the Airacobra from an interceptor into something the Red Army desperately needs, a tank killer that hunts from above. The German tankers call it the Devil's Dive. Stuka pilots refuse to operate in sectors where Pokryshkin's squadron patrols, and the technique he is about to pioneer will save an estimated 1,200 Soviet armored vehicles in the next 4 months alone. This is the story of how one Soviet pilot turned a forbidden maneuver into the most effective ground attack tactic of the Eastern Front. The Bell P-39 Airacobra arrives in Soviet hands through the Lend-Lease program starting in 1942. American and British pilots despise the aircraft. Its mid-mounted engine creates handling problems at high altitude. The unconventional tricycle landing gear feels wrong to pilots trained on tail draggers. The U.S. Army Air Forces relegates Airacobras to training duties and coastal patrol. The RAF rejects them entirely after brief trials, but Soviet pilots discover unexpected advantages. The P-39's 37mm cannon fires through the propeller hub, creating a devastating centerline weapon. At low altitude, where most Eastern Front combat occurs, the Airacobra is faster than the Messerschmitt Bf-109G. The tricycle gear proves ideal for rough Soviet airfields. By mid-1943, the Red Air Force operates over 800 Airacobras across multiple fronts. Yet one critical problem remains unsolved: ground attack. The Ilyushin Il-2 Sturmovik carries armor protection and bombs, but Sturmoviks are slow and vulnerable to German fighters. They require escort, and escorts cannot protect tanks. Soviet command needs fighters that can destroy German armor while defending themselves against Luftwaffe interceptors. Every attempted solution fails. Rockets prove inaccurate. Conventional strafing runs expose fighters to devastating ground fire. A pilot named Ivan Babak tries a shallow dive attack on June 28, 1943, and his Airacobra disintegrates at 400 meters altitude. Structural failure. The official investigation concludes that dive angles exceeding 30 degrees in the P-39 will cause catastrophic wing failure due to compressibility effects and structural stress limits. The Aviation Technical Manual is explicit. Diving attacks in the P-39 aircraft are prohibited beyond 30 degrees angle. Pilots violating this restriction will face disciplinary action. The restriction appears in bold text. Flight commanders brief it at every mission planning session. Meanwhile, the German Panzer divisions advance. At Kursk, the Wehrmacht commits 2,700 tanks and assault guns. Soviet intelligence estimates that Stuka dive bombers account for 40% of Soviet armor losses in the battle's opening phase. The mathematics are unsustainable. The Red Army is losing the armored war, not because German tanks are superior, but because German aircraft destroy Soviet armor before the ground battle begins. The expert consensus is unanimous. Fighters cannot dive bomb effectively. That mission belongs to specialized attack aircraft. Attempting dive attacks in fighters risks losing pilots to structural failure or ground fire. The P-39's design limitations make steep dives suicidal. Soviet aviation doctrine, German doctrine, American doctrine, and British doctrine all agree on this fundamental principle. At the 16th Guards Fighter Aviation Regiment's airfield near Kursk, Captain Alexander Pokryshkin reads these restrictions and watches German armor advance. The stakes could not be clearer. Find a way to kill tanks from fighters, or watch the Red Army's mechanized forces bleed to death under Stuka attacks. Alexander Ivanovich Pokryshkin does not fit the profile of a revolutionary tactician. He is 29 years old. He possesses no engineering degree. He never attended the prestigious Zhukovsky Air Force Engineering Academy. His formal education ended at technical school, where he trained as an aircraft mechanic. He joined the Red Air Force in 1932 as an enlisted ground crew member and spent 6 years maintaining aircraft before the military finally accepted him for pilot training in 1938. His job in July 1943 is straightforward: lead a fighter squadron protecting Soviet ground forces. He has already achieved ace status with 22 confirmed kills. But victories against Luftwaffe fighters do not stop German tanks. Every mission follows the same frustrating pattern: climb to intercept altitude, arrive as Stukas finish their bombing runs, chase scattered formations that dive away at maximum speed. The moment of insight occurs on July 15, 1943, during a mission debriefing. Pokryshkin is reviewing gun camera footage from a failed intercept. The film shows a Stuka formation diving towards Soviet tanks. The angle is approximately 70 degrees. The Stukas release at 300 meters altitude, then pull out in a violent recovery that grays out their pilots. A younger pilot, Lieutenant Grigory Rechkalov, makes an observation. They pull 7 or 8 Gs in that recovery. The Stuka is a slower aircraft than ours. Why can't we dive steeper than 30 degrees if they can dive at 70? The room goes silent. The restriction is doctrine. The structural failure that killed Babak is documented fact. But Pokryshkin pulls out his maintenance logs from his years as a ground crew mechanic. The P-39's wing structure is actually stronger than the Stukas. The American designers built the aircraft to handle high G maneuvers. The 30-degree restriction exists because American pilots encountered compressibility problems at high altitude, where air is thin and speeds increase rapidly in dives. Pokryshkin does the mathematics on a chalkboard. At low altitude, where air is dense, the P-39 will reach terminal velocity at a lower speed than at high altitude. The thick air acts as a brake. If a pilot dives from 3,000 meters instead of 6,000 meters, and if the pilot manages the dive speed carefully, the aircraft might survive angles approaching 60 degrees. The theory is simple. The execution is potentially fatal, and the regulations explicitly forbid the attempt. Pokryshkin does not request permission. On July 16, 1943, at dawn, he tells his crew chief to prepare his personal P-39 for a high-altitude engine test. He files a flight plan for a patrol sector 20 kilometers from the front line. He tells no one his actual intention. His Airacobra lifts off at 47 hours. He climbs to 3,000 meters over empty steppe. There are no witnesses. If the aircraft disintegrates, the official report will attribute the loss to combat or mechanical failure. His wife will receive the standard notification. His daughter will grow up without a father. At 3,000 meters, Pokryshkin rolls inverted and pulls through into a dive. The nose drops through the horizon. 30 degrees, 40 degrees. The airspeed indicator climbs. The airframe begins to vibrate. 45 degrees. The vibration intensifies. 50 degrees. At 55 degrees, Pokryshkin levels the dive angle. The airspeed stabilizes at 480 kilometers per hour. The vibration remains constant but manageable. He holds the dive for 8 seconds, then pulls back on the stick. The G-forces slam him into his seat. His vision tunnels. The altimeter shows he has descended to 800 meters before recovering level flight. The aircraft is intact. The wings have not failed. The controls respond normally. Pokryshkin climbs back to 3,000 meters and repeats the test. This time he increases the dive angle to 60 degrees. The airspeed climbs to 520 kilometers per hour. The vibration becomes violent. At 1,000 meters altitude, he initiates recovery. The G-forces are crushing. His vision goes gray, but the aircraft pulls out at 400 meters altitude. He lands at 06:23 hours. The crew chief inspects the airframe and finds no structural damage, no cracked spars, no buckled skin. The aircraft is airworthy. That afternoon, Pokryshkin briefs his squadron deputy, Captain Dmitry Glinka. He explains the test. He describes the dive angles and recovery altitudes. He proposes using the technique against German armor. Glinka's response is immediate. That is insane. That is explicitly illegal. If you demonstrate that technique, command will court-martial you. If you teach it to the squadron, they will court-martial all of us. The restriction exists because pilots have died. Pokryshkin's answer is equally direct. Pilots are dying now because we cannot stop Stukas. Tank crews are dying because we arrived too late. The restriction is based on high-altitude diving. We operate at low altitude. The physics are different. Pokryshkin demonstrates the dive technique to his squadron on July 17, 1943. 6 pilots witness the demonstration. All 6 volunteer to attempt the maneuver under Pokryshkin's supervision. By evening, 12 pilots in the 16th Guards Fighter Aviation Regiment can execute 60-degree dives in the P-39. Word reaches regimental command within 24 hours. On July 18th, Colonel Ivan Podgorny summons Pokryshkin to headquarters. The meeting includes the regimental commissar, the chief aviation engineer, and a representative from divisional headquarters. The confrontation is immediate. The aviation engineer, Major Leonid Sokolov, holds up the technical manual. This restriction is not a suggestion, Captain. It is based on structural analysis performed by American engineers who designed this aircraft. You are ordering your pilots to violate explicit safety limitations. You are risking catastrophic failures that will kill your men. Pokryshkin presents his test data. He explains the difference between high-altitude and low-altitude diving physics. He describes the controlled tests and the lack of structural damage. The room erupts. The commissar accuses Pokryshkin of reckless endangerment. Major Sokolov calls the technique suicidal improvisation by a mechanic playing engineer. The divisional representative threatens immediate court-martial proceedings. Colonel Podgorny sits silently, listening to both sides. The argument continues for 40 minutes. Then Podgorny raises his hand for silence. He asks one question: can this technique kill German tanks? Pokryshkin's response: yes, Comrade Colonel. The dive angle allows precise aim with the 37mm cannon. The approach is too fast for effective ground fire. We can destroy tanks that Stukas cannot reach because we can defend ourselves against German fighters. Podgorny makes his decision. You have 72 hours to demonstrate combat effectiveness. If the technique works, I will defend it to front command. If it fails, or if we lose aircraft to structural failure, I will personally ensure your court-martial. Dismissed. CTA, Member 1. Before we see whether Pokryshkin's gamble pays off, quick reminder to hit that subscribe button. We bring you these untold stories of military innovation every week, and your support helps us keep researching these incredible pieces of history. Now, let's see what happened when Pokryshkin's squadron took their forbidden technique into combat. July 20th, 1943, 13:47 hours. Pokryshkin leads 8 Airacobras toward German positions near Orel. Soviet ground forces have reported a Panzer concentration preparing for a counterattack. Intelligence indicates minimal Luftwaffe fighter presence in the sector. The formation climbs to 3,500 meters. Below them, Pokryshkin identifies the target. 17 Panzer IV tanks moving in column formation along a dirt road. No Stuka formations in sight. The Germans believe they are safe from air attack in daylight. Pokryshkin rolls inverted and pulls through into his dive. 62 degrees. The Panzer column grows in his gun sight. At 1,000 meters, he opens fire with the 37mm cannon. The first burst strikes a Panzerwerfer's rear deck. The tank explodes. Pokryshkin pulls out at 350 meters, the G-forces crushing him into his seat. Behind him, 7 more Airacobras execute the same attack profile. In 90 seconds, the squadron destroys or disables 11 German tanks. The surviving Panzers scatter into nearby woods. German anti-aircraft fire hits nothing. The diving Airacobras are moving too fast and the attack angle is too steep for effective tracking. The squadron returns to base at 14:12 hours. 0 losses. 11 confirmed tank kills. The gun camera footage is undeniable. Over the next 4 days, Pokryshkin's squadron conducts 14 ground attack missions using the dive technique. The results are documented in official Soviet combat reports. July 20th, 9 tank kills, 1 armored car destroyed. July 22nd, 7 tank kills, 3 trucks destroyed. July 23rd, 12 tank kills, 2 self-propelled guns destroyed. July 24th, 8 tank kills, 1 ammunition truck destroyed. Secondary explosion. The technique proves devastatingly effective. The 60-degree dive angle provides accuracy comparable to dedicated dive bombers. The 37mm cannon's hitting power is superior to the Stukas bombs against armored targets. The Airacobra's speed and maneuverability allow pilots to escape before German fighters can intercept. By July 26th, Divisional Command orders the technique taught to all P-39 squadrons in the sector. By August 1st, over 200 Soviet pilots are qualified in what becomes officially designated as steep-angle ground attack procedure. German records document the impact. A captured Panzer commander, Hauptmann Friedrich Weber, provides testimony in August 1943. The Russian fighters attack from directly above, faster than Stukas. Our anti-aircraft cannot track them. They appear without warning and destroy multiple vehicles before we can respond. My company lost 9 tanks in 2 weeks to these attacks. We now move only at night in sectors where these aircraft operate. Luftwaffe pilot reports show similar concern. Oberleutnant Hans Rudel, the famous Stuka ace, writes in his diary on August 15, 1943, "The enemy has developed a new tactic with American fighters. They dive nearly vertically and fire cannon. Several Stuka units have been reassigned because these fighters now perform our mission more effectively. It is humiliating." The quantitative data validates the technique's effectiveness. Between July 20th and October 31, 1943, Soviet P-39 squadrons using Pokryshkin's dive attack method destroy over 800 German armored vehicles in the Kursk sector. The loss rate for attacking aircraft is 3.2%, compared to 11.7% for Il-2 Sturmovix performing similar missions during the same period. Soviet tank commanders report the impact directly. Guards Colonel Pavel Rotmistrov, commanding the 5th Guards Tank Army, writes in his after-action report, "Air support from Captain Pokryshkin's fighter units has proven decisive in multiple engagements. German armored formations that previously attacked with confidence now hesitate when our fighters appear. Enemy tanks disperse and seek cover rather than maintain formation. This behavioral change has saved countless Soviet vehicles and lives." The technique spreads beyond the Kursk sector. By December 1943, Soviet Aviation Command incorporates steep-angle ground attack procedures into official P-39 tactical doctrine. Training programs at operational conversion units include the maneuver. New pilots arriving from flight school learn the technique before their first combat mission. Pokryshkin's personal combat record demonstrates the method's effectiveness. Between July 20th and December 31st, 1943, he personally destroys 47 German armored vehicles, in addition to his air-to-air victories. His squadron accounts for 193 confirmed ground kills during the same period. The German response evolves. Panzer units begin posting additional anti-aircraft vehicles in formations. Tank commanders order dispersed movement patterns rather than column formations. Some units request Luftwaffe fighter escort even when moving behind front lines. These defensive measures reduce German armored mobility and operational effectiveness. CTA Thunderbolt 2. The impact of this forbidden technique went far beyond just one battle. If you're finding this story as fascinating as we did while researching it, do us a favor and hit that like button. It really helps the algorithm show these stories to more history enthusiasts like yourself. And stick around, because what happened after the war is just as remarkable. Soviet statistical analysis conducted in early 1944 estimates that P-39 ground attack missions using steep-angle diving tactics prevented the loss of approximately 1,200 Soviet tanks and assault guns during the second half of 1943. The analysis compares sectors where the technique was employed against sectors where conventional fighter tactics remained in use. The survival rate for Soviet armor improves by 34% in sectors with P-39 dive attack coverage. Individual pilot testimonials document the human impact. Lieutenant Alexei Maresyev, who lost both legs and returned to combat flying P-39s, later writes, "Pokryshkin showed us that the aircraft's limitations existed in manuals, not in reality. We stopped accepting what we were told was impossible and started testing what might be possible. That mindset saved the lives of countless tankers who never knew our names." The war ends. Alexander Pokryshkin survives with 59 confirmed air-to-air victories, making him the second highest-scoring Soviet ace. But his ground attack innovations remain classified until 1953. Soviet military doctrine considers the steep-angle dive technique a tactical secret worth protecting. When the technique is finally declassified, Pokryshkin refuses interviews about his role in its development. In a rare 1956 statement, he says, "I did what any pilot would do when watching good men die unnecessarily. The glory belongs to the pilots who trusted the technique and the tank crews who lived because of it." The production numbers tell the story's scale. The Soviet Union receives 4,146 P-39 Airacobras through Lend-Lease. Soviet pilots using Pokryshkin's dive attack methods destroy an estimated 2,300 German armored vehicles between July 1943 and May 1945. The technique accounts for approximately 18% of all German armor losses on the Eastern Front during this period. Soviet tank veterans remember. In 1965, Guards Colonel Rotmistrov, now retired, encounters Pokryshkin at a military ceremony. Rotmistrov salutes and says, "Comrade Marshal, my tank army survived Kursk because your fighters killed the German tanks before they killed us. Every man who served under my command owes you a debt we can never repay." The tactical innovation influences post-war doctrine. The Soviet Air Force incorporates steep-angle ground attack procedures into jet fighter training programs. The technique evolves into modern close air support tactics used by air forces worldwide. The fundamental principle remains unchanged. Dive angle determines accuracy, and accuracy determines survival for ground forces. Modern air forces still teach variations of Pokryshkin's technique. The U.S. Air Force A-10 Thunderbolt II employs steep diving attacks with its 30mm cannon. The attack profile mirrors Pokryshkin's 60-degree dives, adapted for jet aircraft speeds. NATO close air support doctrine explicitly references Soviet-developed steep-angle gun attacks as a foundational tactical concept. The Bell P-39 Airacobra, rejected by American and British forces as inadequate, becomes the Soviet Union's most effective ground attack fighter. Soviet pilots fly the type until 1949. The aircraft's reputation transforms from failure to legend entirely because one pilot questioned a restriction in a manual. Pokryshkin never seeks recognition for the innovation. He serves in the Soviet Air Force until 1968, retiring as a marshal of aviation. He writes technical papers on fighter tactics but rarely mentions his own contributions. When asked about his legacy in a 1975 interview, he responds, "I was a mechanic who became a pilot. I understood that aircraft can do more than engineers predict if pilots are willing to test the limits carefully. That is not genius. That is simply refusing to accept unnecessary limitations." He dies in 1985. His funeral in Moscow draws thousands of veterans. Among them are former tank commanders who never met Pokryshkin, but whose lives he saved by turning a forbidden maneuver into a life-saving tactic. The lesson transcends aviation history. Expertise can create limitations as rigid as physical laws. Official doctrine can prevent solutions that save lives. Sometimes the most important innovations come from people who lack the credentials to know what is impossible and therefore have the freedom to discover what is actually possible. One pilot, one forbidden dive, and 1,200 Soviet tanks that survived because someone questioned a restriction in a manual. That is the legacy of Alexander Pokryshkin's 72-hour gamble against doctrine, physics, and military bureaucracy. The forbidden technique that became standard procedure. The court-martial threat that became official doctrine. The maverick mechanic-turned-pilot who saved thousands of lives by refusing to accept that what worked for Stukas could not work for Airacobras.